Last couple of weeks around our church have been a lot of fun. Thursday night launched. Our Twilliger campus had a birthday. They turned 1, and all of the groups and ministries and programs have all kicked off. And so it's been kind of really exciting around here. But not just here at Hope City. Really, millions and millions of people have really experienced a great joy over the past couple of weeks because Survivor's back on. And if you don't know, Survivor is my absolute favorite show, and I've talked about that in detail, all right? So I'm not going to go into that again. But I love that show, except for one thing about it. There's a segment called The Loved Ones Visit. Now, if you're not familiar with it, what happens is these survivors, they choose one loved one before the season even starts that if they're to make it to day 30 on the show, the loved one actually visits them on the island. And so what happens is it's like this intense blubber fest. And so their loved one comes running out of the jungle in like slow motion, and they hug, and there's tears, and there's snot. And I'm just thinking the whole time, like, come on. Like it's been 30 days. It's been 30 days. My wife will look at me and think I'm insensitive, which is kind of true in that scenario. And then she'll say something like, wouldn't you cry if you didn't see me for 30 days? And I'm like, of course, honey. Of course I would act that way. But it's really interesting to watch. Well, it's slightly interesting to watch because, these people are tough people. They've been, taken away from everything that they know. They're surviving the elements. They have very little food to go on, and there's a constant paranoia in the gameplay. But yet, when they encounter and embrace their loved one, these tough people with these tough exteriors, they just break. And it's worth thinking about the profound effect that our loved ones have on our life. But the interesting thing is that it's not just our loved ones that have this effect. Just people have this effect. Doesn't matter if they're our coworkers or neighbors or our Uber driver or random strangers on the internet. Our interactions with people, they elicit strong emotional responses in us. A surprise gesture of kindness can really change the trajectory of your day. And an unwelcome gesture on the way to work or drive to work can taint your entire morning. And there's really no getting around this. We don't live in an island unto ourselves. We don't live in a vacuum. It wouldn't even be, we wouldn't even want that for your life if it was possible. And the reason is because you were created for relationship. You're created for relationship, first and foremost with God. A few weeks ago, we talked about this in detail, but when people wonder what the meaning is of life and what it's all about and the purpose, the only answer that I can think of that makes any sort of sense is this, is that you're principally created to enjoy a relationship with God. What else can it be? It can't be just the accumulation of money and stuff. It can't be that. Because people have done that. They've accumulated more than they ever need. They have more money they can ever spend. And they've told you from the top of the financial ladder that it's empty up here. People have gone before us and done that and told us that's not it. It can't be fulfilling some sort of personal goal or achievement, although there is meaning in that, no doubt. To manifest the potential that God has placed inside of you is something worthwhile to exercise and shoot for. And it'd be a shame if you didn't. But if that was it, then that would be depressing. Because how do you know when you get there? When you're better than everybody else? How do you measure that? And is that even possible? There's like a 0% chance of that happening because someone else always comes around who's better at it. And so it's like this carrot that just dangles in front of your face that you're never really able to get. And so that can't be it either. But to find out what you're created for and who created you and why you were created, that's where it's at. That's meaning. That's where purpose is found. So you were made for a relationship with God. But not just God, with others too. Now, the biblical narrative, it states this really strongly within the opening chapters of the Bible. In the second chapter of Genesis, we see this to be true. God creates a man named Adam, and he gives Adam this task of stewarding and being responsible for God's good creation, not for destroying it, but for stewarding it and taking really good care of it. And then God sees Adam's state, and he's lonely. And so God says this, it is not good for man to be alone. And that's still true today. So God sees lonely Adam, and he creates for Adam someone else. We were made for other people as well. Now, if you're not a Christian, and if you're not really sure about the whole Bible thing, and that's not a source of authority for you, it still seems to be true from your own experience, but this is what data tells us as well. I was just reading an article from the American Psychological Association, the APA, that was kind of writing a response to the dehumanizing and brutal corrective measures of isolation in prisons. And it says this, that deprived of normal human interaction and relationship, segregated prisoners often suffer from mental health problems, including anxiety, panic, insomnia, paranoia, aggression, depression, and suicidal tendencies. Loneliness and isolation, it breaks people. It is not the way we were created to live. And this is one of the reasons why church is so important. And I don't mean in the sense of gathering, for 1 hour once a week. I'm not talking about that. That's important, no doubt. But the sense of people who worship Jesus as Lord, coming together, not just to sing and not just to listen to a message, but to come together and open up their lives to other people, to be held accountable to other people, to share life with other people, to pray for and be prayed for from other people. That's why church is so important. Church really should do community best. My mom moved up from Calgary to Edmonton last year, and it was psychologically a tough move for her. And the reason is primarily she had developed really great friendships over the course of multiple decades, and she was leaving those friendships, at least in a physical sense. And if relationships are as important as the Bible claims they are, as you experience them to be, and as data seems to show, well, she should be worried about that. And so when she moved up, I asked her if she would get involved and join a serve team here at the church as a way to contribute. We just don't want people coming, but we want people contributing to this church. That's what makes it go. And I said, would you consider joining a serve team as a way to contribute, but also connect and maybe make some friends? And so she looked around and she wanted to get involved with Freedom Sessions, so she started serving there. And what I have seen over the past year is the church at its absolute best. It was able to take someone who knew nobody and find a loving community for her where people genuinely cared for her needs, for her psychological well-being, for her physical well-being. And it has been amazing to see our church rise to the challenge for her life. And I know that happens in hundreds of different people's lives. This is why the church is so important. We were made for relationship. We know this at the very core of who we are. But the problem and the tension is this. People sometimes are just the worst, right? Like, we're made and we can receive so much joy and fulfillment out of our relationships, but it's also such a pain point for a lot of us. It's a source of tragedy in so many of our lives. Relationships can start even as a major joy in our life and devolve into something much, much worse, to the point where we wish we were never in relationship with those people in the first place. You're in love and you get married, but 10 years later, you're seriously contemplating divorce. You wish you never met them in the first place. You have a best friend, man, you're a ride or die partner, but then she said something to that person about you, or he did that thing that you never thought he'd do, and you wish that you never met that person. Your mom and dad growing up, they're your hero, but something happens over the course of years and decades, and now you just kind of have to grin and bear family get-togethers, ignore their calls, and you're not sure exactly what happened, but there's this pain and distance in your relationship. The very thing that we're made for, the thing that ought to be the chief source or a chief source of joy in our life has become a thief of joy in our life. And how can something that God created to be so good go so bad? And so a question worth asking yourself is this: how can I maximize the health and minimize the heartache of my relationships? How can I maximize the health and minimize the heartache? And I chose those words carefully because one really bad way to think about the relational tragedy and breakdown in your life is to blame it on everybody else. And fair enough, there are relationships that we get into that are sources of pain in our life, and it is the other person's fault. Their actions, their thoughts, their words, they are the ones to blame. No doubt that happens. And you aren't responsible for that, but you are responsible for you. The Apostle Paul, he planted and pastored many churches in the first century. And he was writing and pastoring to a church in Rome. And he said these words. He says, if it is possible, it's not always going to be possible, but when it is, and as far as it depends on you, meaning you can't control other people, but you hopefully can control yourself. As far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. So this question, how can I maximize the health and minimize the heartache in my relationships? It puts the onus on you where it ought to be when it comes to your relational health. And if you want the best out of the relationships that you keep with others, it does require an admission and a humbling on your part that you recognize that at least sometimes you are part of the problem and that you might need relational rehab. And so we're in the third week of these series of talks, and we've been going to the Bible each week as our guide on relationships. And that seems like the right thing to do, because if God did create us, and if he created us for relationship, who better to tell us how to do relationships right? So we're going to focus in on the very first book of the New Testament called Matthew. And the passage that we're going to look at is going to be familiar to almost everybody in here, regardless if you are totally unfamiliar with the Bible or your Bible is falling apart because it gets so much use. You're going to be familiar with this passage. Now, we call the book of Matthew the Gospel according to Matthew. And Matthew wrote this book as an early biography of the life of Jesus. And gospel simply means good news. And so Matthew was writing about the good news of Jesus. And the good news is this: Jesus has come, and he's brought with him what Matthew describes as the kingdom of heaven. And those words, kingdom of heaven, are strewn throughout the whole book of Matthew. It's a major theme, and it's worth knowing what it means. Essentially, it just means this, that this is God's way here on earth. And so Jesus spends a lot of time in this book talking about how the kingdom of heaven, or God's way, operates. And it's very different from the way that we operate. And so this is really concentrated in Jesus' most famous sermon called the Sermon on the Mount. And the Sermon on the Mount is filled with really beautiful and challenging ethics. Jesus envisions and gives us this vision for what life could be like if we lived out God's kingdom in our life. Now, I don't care if you're Christian or Muslim or Buddhist or agnostic or atheist or a Jedi Knight, it doesn't really matter. If you read the Sermon on the Mount, it's impossible to go away without thinking he's right. Jesus is right. Jesus' teaching here, it transcends religious borders because it's true. And I want to challenge you and encourage you to read Matthews 5, 6, and 7. Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7. You'll come away thinking it's true. It's a better way to live. Now, what you'll notice in the Sermon on the Mount is Jesus is constantly taking a philosophy or idea that is widely accepted by the society, and he's kind of upping the ante a little bit. He'll say something like this: "You've heard it been said, but I say." So he'll say something, "You've heard it been said, you shall not murder or you'll be subject to judgment." He'll say, "But I say, do not be angry with your brother or you'll be subject to judgment." "You've heard it been said, do not commit adultery. But I say, do not look at a woman lustfully or else you've already committed adultery in your heart." You've heard it been said, love your neighbors and hate your enemies. But I say, love your enemies. So he's constantly upping the ante, and what he's doing is describing how things operate in the kingdom of heaven. This is God's way. And if you want to participate in God's way, then this is how you think and you live and you operate. And so Jesus starts with this, chapter 7. "Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you." Jesus is talking in particular about people of faith who choose to follow God, judging people who have not made that choice, who are outside of that faith. So Jesus continues. "Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye?" When Jesus was saying this, most commentators believe that this was kind of like a joke and people would have been laughing. Jesus is using kind of hyperbole to illustrate what's happening here. So people will be like, "A log in your own eye." That's funny, right? And then, so Jesus continues. "How can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' when all the time there's a plank in your own eye?" Things kind of shift here a little bit. And Jesus goes, "You hypocrite." So people would be like, this isn't so funny anymore. "You hypocrite. First take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye." And for the Jesus followers in the room, we need to understand that it is totally out of place to judge people who are not followers of Jesus with the standards that Jesus sets for his followers. The New Testament is dead clear on this. If you want to challenge me on that, read 1 Corinthians 5, read it in detail, because it is clear that Christians are not supposed to judge people who do not claim to be Christians with the standards that Jesus set for Christians. Why would people of the kingdom of heaven judge other people who do not want to belong to the kingdom of heaven? We don't do that. You don't judge people who have a different lifestyle than mine, who make choices that are different than me, who understand sexuality different than me, who understand the important things of life like God and faith and meaning, and who think differently about the things on the front page of the news or on our social media feed. In the New Testament book called 1 Corinthians, the Apostle Paul, he says these, what I would describe as soul-aligning words. He says this, brothers and sisters, think of what you were. Think of what you were when you were called, meaning think of what you were when you met Christ. Sometimes we have a bad memory and we forget who we were before we met Christ. And when Christians judge people who are not Christians, what they do is they set themselves up as God. They think it was them that transformed their own heart, that it was them that renewed their mind. But we have no reason to boast. And if we are going to boast, it's about God's goodness in our life and the changes he has brought into our life, not our own goodness. So Jesus says, and you're concerned with a speck in somebody else's eye? Come on. You know the way that the people of the kingdom of heaven are supposed to live, and you still have a ways to go. You're not flawless, and so that speck in their eye, it's like a 2x4 in yours. When we get in relational hot water, when we are concerned with fixing what we think is wrong with other people, instead of praying, search me, O God, search my heart. And besides, this principle that Jesus states here, of the whole business of judging others and leaving that to God, it's good for you. It's good for your relationships. Because when you are able to stop judging, you can start loving. I've heard people say, well, I love them by judging them, by correcting them. Ask the people who you judge if they feel loved. They don't. You cut the relational tether between you and a person when you judge them. Now, all of that kind of lead up to this next phrase that Jesus says, the one that's going to be familiar to most people here listening. It says this, so in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you. For this sums up the law and the prophets, meaning it sums up all of this. That one sentence. In everything you do to others what you would have them do to you. This is known famously as the golden rule. I remember reciting this in public school in elementary. I was just watching the Food Network, which is like a really bad show to watch when you're hungry because it's like, Satan, get behind me. Everything you watch, it's like, oh my gosh, this is so good. Anyway, so I'm watching this show, and a commercial from Marriott, which is a hotel chain, came on, and it was based around the golden rule. And so I was thinking about what I was going to talk to you today, and so I rewound the commercial to listen to it again. I wanted to poke holes in it, see, well, they probably didn't understand what Jesus meant because, this is just a pagan commercial. Who knows, right? Anyway, so I started watching. I'm like, they actually did a really good job with this. They seem to get it. And it seems as if the golden rule stated here by Jesus is widely adopted and accepted by Christians and non-Christians and other faiths alike. It just seems like this is a good rule to live by. I was reading a critique of Jesus' ethics in the Sermon on the Mount, and particularly this golden rule here. And the critique is, this isn't new. Jesus didn't come up with this. In fact, there's plenty of religions and plenty of religious leaders that predated Jesus who already had similar golden rules that would have been circulating in the culture at large. And Jesus is simply regurgitating an already established rule of morality that other teachers before him already came up with. And there seems to be a little bit of accuracy to that. In ancient Sanskrit, which is the liturgical language of Hinduism, it says this, treat others as you treat yourself. So this predated Jesus, and this sounds fairly similar to what Jesus says, not exactly, but it's similar. 4,000-year-old Persian religion, which is still practiced today, called Zoroastrianism. I actually have a friend who is part of this religion. He states, or the Zoroastrian states, that whatever is disagreeable to yourself, do not do unto others. Isocrates was a Greek orator, and he lived 400 years before Jesus, and he said this: "Do not do to others that which angers you when they do it to you." And even Judaism, which had been the religion followed by all of Jesus' listeners, and even Jesus himself was Jewish, they have a saying that says, "What is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow man." Now, what's important to remember is what Jesus is doing in the Sermon on the Mount is he's kind of upping the ante of everything. And he's doing that right here with this golden rule as well. And so Jesus chose his words really carefully. People in his audience would have been familiar with a few of these golden rules floating around. If they're really educated, maybe most of them. And see, the other versions of the golden rule that predated Jesus, they're all about reciprocity. It's about reciprocal living. You're mimicking the people that you're in relationship with. If they're kind to you, make sure you're kind back. And if you don't want to get cheated, then make sure you don't cheat other people. If you don't want to get lied to, then don't lie to other people. And that's a fairly basic, foundational, wise, moral ethic that we ought to live by. But see, Jesus, he's raising the stakes. What Jesus says here is not based on some sort of reciprocity or mimicking behavior. Listen again to what Jesus says. He says, "So in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you." Meaning, do to others even if they don't do it to you. Jesus is saying your relationship with other people and your interactions with other people isn't based on how they relate to you. Your words, your thought, your actions cannot be dictated by other people. As far as it depends on you, live at peace with everybody. As far as it depends on you. In other words, take responsibility for you. It doesn't matter about them and what they say. What matters is what you do and what you say. And imagine how many relationships could have been salvaged if we would do this. If we responded to anger with kindness. If we responded to betrayal with patience. If we responded to somebody's lies with grace. See, the other golden rules, they would have landed you in the exact same relational trouble because it's just based off reciprocity. But Jesus, he breathes hope into broken relationships because we don't treat others well because they treat us well. We don't treat others well with love and compassion because we're in a good mood, because it's convenient for us, or because we think we may get something in return. We do it because Jesus did that for us. Because Jesus did that for us. See, the golden rule is agreeable to most people, not everyone. Some people are blinded by hurt. Some people are dead set on revenge, and so Jesus' words here are just foolishness. But to many people in here, you can conclude that this is really the only way to break the cycle of relational dysfunction. You can't just meet lies with lies. You can't just meet anger with anger. You can't just be eye for an eye. It doesn't work like that. Relationships will continue to get in trouble and will continue to devolve if you act out in reciprocity. The only way to break it is to do unto others, even if they don't do unto you. And you can see how this could saved you a world of hurt in your past relationships. And if you started living that today, how it brings potential into your relationships that they could be a source of joy and not pain for you. And so it's one thing to agree with Jesus. But it's a whole other thing to live this out. And it's hard to live out, no doubt. Because our natures, we lean towards reciprocity. There's a reason why all these other golden rules existed, because they make sense, they're natural. We lean towards getting even. When somebody hurts us, we just want to double punch it to their face and kick them in the kneecap. That is natural for us. We lean that way. So how do you even begin to live out this ethic that Jesus blew up and then raised the stakes, to do unto others even if they don't do unto you? You start by remembering what Jesus did for you. See, Jesus didn't talk the talk. He didn't just give you this moral ethic and then not live it out. He lived it out, man, in living color with his own flesh and blood. See, God desires a relationship with you. God desires a relationship with you. And some of us have a really hard time believing that because God seems far away. And you're right. God does seem far away. And it seems that way because there's a problem. Every religious person and every irreligious person would agree that there's a disconnect between us and God. And the Bible describes this problem as sin. And it's not a simple problem. It's a problem that is inherent in every single human and affects every single person. Because sin and the nature of sin is to separate. We experience this in our own relationships with one another. When we sin against someone, in other words, when we do something to someone that we ought not to do, or when they do it to us, it separates us relationally. There's a distance between you and them. And we experience this in our relationship with God as well. And what we try to do to make it better, at least with God, is we just try to be good. If we could just be good enough, then maybe that gap can close and maybe God will like us and we'll be able to experience God. People have driven themselves crazy trying to figure out how good they have to be. Because what if their goodness isn't good enough? And so instead of having this ever-moving standard of goodness, God sent himself in the person of Jesus, who was ultimately good, and in him was no sin. God sent himself in Jesus to take care of the problem of sin that separates. See, the sins of the world were laid upon Jesus in every bad thing that I have ever done, in every bad thing that you have ever done, in every bad thing that I will ever do, and every bad thing that you will ever do. And the consequence of that is separation from God was laid upon Jesus. And when Jesus took that to the cross and he died, so did the separating power of sin. And when Jesus rose from the grave, what happened is he eradicated that separation so that you can get back to what you're created to doing, which is to have and enjoy a relationship with God. Everybody who puts their faith in Jesus and in him alone, not in your ability to be good, but in him alone, can have life that starts now and it lasts forever. You can enjoy a relationship with him. This is the ultimate living out of the golden rule. Jesus did for us that which we never did for him and we couldn't do. And just as we have been forgiven, we extend forgiveness. We have to. Just as we have received grace, it's demanded of us to extend grace to others, and not because they deserve it, because they don't, but either did we. So we live out the golden rule because we remember what Jesus did for us. When Jesus extended to us that which we didn't deserve, he blew up the traditional way of navigating relationships. And he showed us what it looks like to be a people who are part of this kingdom of heaven movement. This is God's way. And if you want to participate in God's way, and the basis of that in our relationships is this idea of the golden rule. So when your boss acts out unfairly to you, you don't repay him or her with evil thoughts and with cutting corners, but instead with kindness. When your friend cancels on you again or hurts you deeply, you don't respond to them with gossip. You respond with grace. When your spouse tears a strip off you and you don't really know why, and you want to respond with silent treatment or anger or passive-aggressive treatment, you don't. Instead, you respond with patience. And for that relationship in your life that is broken and you think is unmendable, and maybe you're right, but maybe you're not, God would say to you today, what can you do to reach out? And as far as it depends on you, can you live at peace with that person? Because maybe you can. And I know that you would say sorry and things would be okay if they ever admitted that they were wrong. But to live out the golden rule means you don't wait for them. And your reaction to them isn't based on their reaction to you, but you take that first step. Not because they deserve it, because they probably don't, but you didn't either. But Jesus reminds us what it means to live in the kingdom of heaven when it comes to our relationships. Today we're going to take part in communion. Communion is a tradition that Jesus started, and he gathered his followers around him, and he took bread, which represented his body, and he took wine, which represented his blood, as a tactile way of remembering what Jesus was going to do on the cross. Now, we don't use bread and wine anymore because it's not about bread and wine, it's about remembering what Jesus did, and so we use a cracker and juice to the same effect. Now, we practice what's called open communion here, which means if you follow Christ, but you don't regularly attend this church, you're very welcome to come and join with us today. If you do not follow Christ, then we are going to ask that, although we are absolutely glad that you're here and welcome here, this is one thing we ask for you, just to observe what's happening. So I'm going to ask the ushers to come forward and to distribute the crackers and the juice. And as they do, our band's going to lead us in a song. And as they lead, I want you to press in and reflect on Jesus' life and what he did for you and what that could mean for your relationships moving forward.
Children of
followers gathered around him, Jesus says these words, "This is my body," referring to the bread he was holding. "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." So as we eat the cracker, we think about the forgiveness that's extended towards us, even though we didn't deserve it. Let's also think about those in our life that God has placed in our life and the forgiveness that we have to extend towards them as well. To eat the cracker together. Jesus continued holding the cup. He says this, "This cup is the new covenant of my blood. Do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me." As we drink of the juice, we think about and reflect on the joy that we have in our life because Jesus took care of that separation between us and him. We also think about the joy that we can have in relationships with one another, and we thank God for the joy that we can have in relationships with one another. As we do unto others, as we'd have them do unto us. Let's take together. You would stand with me. As you do, if you want to pass your cup to the nearest aisles, our ushers will come and collect those. We're going to sing this song one more time, and so let's continue to reflect on this golden rule, what it means for our life and what it means as Jesus performed that in the ultimate way on the cross for you. Let's continue to pray.
So don't let your heart be troubled. Hold your head up high, don't fear no evil. Fix your eyes on this one truth. God is madly in love with you. So take courage, hold on, be strong. Remember where help comes from. Swing wide on the heavens, let the praise go up as the walls come down. All creation, everything with breath repeat the sound. All His children, clean hands, pure hearts, good grace, good God. His name is Jesus. Swing wide, all ye heavens, let the praise go up as the walls come down. All creation, everything with breath repeat the sound. All His children, clean hands, pure hearts, good grace, good God. His name is Jesus. Sing it one last time. Swing wide, all ye heavens, let the praise go up as the walls come down. All creation, everything with breath repeat the sound. All His children, clean hands, pure hearts, good grace, good God. His name is Jesus. Jesus, our redemption, our salvation is in His blood. Jesus, light of heaven, friend forever, His kingdom come.
Let me pray for you. Jesus, we thank you. We thank you for, Lord, not just this idea that you presented, but how you lived it out in such a real way that made a real difference in our life. We thank you for the relationship that we can have with God because you destroyed the power and penalty of sin. And Lord, we pray for each person here, Lord, who's experiencing trouble in their own relationships. Lord, you know what's going on, but I pray that you would speak to every heart in only the way that you can, Lord, to give clarity and courage, Lord, that we would act out this golden rule in real life, in our life, in courageous ways, broken relationships can be mended, and the relationships that we keep right now can be a source of joy in our life, the way you created them to be. We thank you, Lord. Amen. Today we talked about ultimate meaning, being found in relationship with God. And if you're here today and want that for your life, or you want to figure out what that could look like in your life, we have a way of helping you take that next step here. And all you have to do is text the word life to number 555-888. What happens is you get a response with a little ebook that helps you take some of those next steps, but also gives you an opportunity to talk to someone from our pastoral team if you'd like. You don't have to do that, but that's something that could be helpful. We also are going to have pastors up at the front right of the room here who would love to help you and talk to you about that decision. But if you have anything else you'd like to pray for, or want agreement in, or just cover you in prayer, we'd love to do it as well. Other than that, thank you for being in church today and have an incredible week.